Good afternoon and welcome everybody, and welcome to the Center for the Study of Cooperatives seminar series for April. And this is the last one before our summer break, so I hope everybody's able to be winding down their academic and otherwise activities. So we're going to do the same with the seminar. We're going to pick back up in September, so we'll welcome you back in September. My name is Audra Kruger, and I work at the Center as the Education and Research and Liaison Officer. And it's my pleasure to introduce Haley Hesseln today. But before I do that, I'd encourage you to move up. There's lots of space up here. I'm feeling that maybe there's something wrong with us. You're sitting far away or something. But anyway, I'll continue. So please feel free to move up and take a seat up front. Haley Hesseln is from Saskatchewan. She's originally from Uranium City. So that's her claim to fame. She's a true northerner and grew up there. And I think moved here when she was 16 or so. So she is a person that enjoys Saskatchewan. She's been here at the University of Saskatchewan and she completed her commerce degree with a focus in economics in 1991. Then she left to complete her PhD, and that was in forest economics, and she completed that in 1997. And she returned to the University of Saskatchewan in 2003, and since then she's performed a number of roles here at the University of Saskatchewan. Most recently, she's residing in the Department of Bioresources, Policy, Business and Economics, the College of Agriculture, formerly known as the College of Agriculture, I believe. She teaches land and environmental economics, conducts research on economics of forestry and forestry fires, and she has done research on the economics of wildfires and fuel management, including the examination of costs of fuel treatments such as prescribed burning and mechanical fuel reduction. I don't know a lot about that, but she could probably talk for hours. Her current research interests include the change of the boreal forest and property rights and regimes associated with that. And I know that Haley's really excited to share her sort of endeavor into cooperative thinking, but she's just excited probably to talk about her pets, her cats, rats, and her dog named Willie. But with that, I'll hand it over to Haley. Thank you, Haley.
Okay, thank you for letting everybody know that I'm crazy, and now there's proof, and it's on film, I guess. I do keep rats. I wasn't allowed to have dogs and cats when I was a grad student, and so the apartment owner said no cats and dogs, but he didn't specifically say no rodents. So I got a couple of rats, and then I got a couple more, and I've had 50 some over the last 12 years. And of course, when I moved back to Saskatchewan and I started taking them to the veterinarian, my colleagues, I remember the first time, it might have been Richard Gray, said, "Why don't I just give you a shovel and save you the money?" So when people hear I've got rats, it's not a great place to be a rat owner. Anyway, I haven't done any forestry cooperative work, but I think the potential is there, and I'm interested in looking at that. So that, I think, will be my next research endeavor. And I'll give you a little bit of a background on why that is. I got back here to Saskatchewan in 2003, and I was lucky to start working with the University of the Arctic, which is a network. And I became the Dean of Undergraduate Studies around 2006, and I've been lucky to be able to travel to all 8 Arctic countries. So this is the map we use in UArctic, and what you can see here is the boreal forest. Anywhere I went, with the exception of Greenland and Iceland, anywhere I landed looked like I was landing in northern Saskatchewan. It looked like Uranium City, only there were people and good roads. So you see the boreal forest, we've got the boreal forest here. And the similarities are striking. The resources are the same, hardwoods and softwoods. They have great forest industries all through Russia, through Scandinavia, and the US. The climate's the same. I don't know how this worked out, but I did most of my traveling in the winter when it was cold and dark. I quite like that, actually. But the climate is the same, cold and dark, which means slower growing seasons, and similar types of resources. We're not talking big redwoods, we're talking smaller trees. Also, this element of remoteness. You go to these places in northern Scandinavia and Russia, and you have small communities that are relatively remote, and they have the same kind of demands for energy, for heat, for power, for wood products. And so we have many, many similarities with the communities and the resources. On the other hand, we have a lot of differences as well. And one of the most striking differences that I've seen, particularly in Scandinavia, is innovation. They use their forests much differently from the way we use our forests. So I think Audra was there once with me as well. We've been there a couple times, to the Skellefteå kraft mill in northern Sweden. This is a mill that produces pellets and energy and district heating. So it provides jobs for the community. The people get the heat in the community. If they're not on the district heating system, they often work in the wood products industry, and then they burn the pellets. They focus on electricity and power, wind energy, and water energy. So here is something that is run sort of like a cooperative, because there's municipal element to it, but not quite. So it's a similar model, and you see this all over Scandinavia. And so the question is, why don't we have this in Saskatchewan? We have the same kind of resource, we have the same kind of communities, the same kind of challenges with respect to climate and transportation, those types of issues. So this is the question, why don't we do this in Saskatchewan? So I want to sort of get around to leaving you with 3 points. Saskatchewan has a vast underutilized timber resource that we could be using for energy, not just 2x4s and posts and poles, but for many different other things. The second point is that the traditional economy is incredibly weak. And when it does recover, it's not likely going to look the way it did in the last 5, 10, 15, 100 years. We're probably not going to be producing posts and poles and 2x4s. There are different kind of products that we should be focusing on. The third point is that while in Saskatchewan we don't have forestry cooperatives, we don't have any really in the West. BC has a couple now. But this might be a better way to organize our economic activity in the forestry sector than what we've been doing with the big forestry companies like Weyerhaeuser and Domtar. So these are the 3 points that I would like to address throughout the presentation. So let's first take a look at the resource. When we think of, most people in Saskatchewan think farming and prairies, but most of the province is covered in trees. I think it's what, 54%. So this part above is all trees. 97% of the forest is Crown land. It's run, owned, and managed by the provincial government. There's a little bit by the federal government for Indian lands. The resource, just to give you an idea, 65 million hectares is the size of Saskatchewan, and the forest is 35 million hectares. Of that 35 million, about 37% of that is commercial forest. This would be this green area in here. So this is where most of our forest resources, which makes sense, first of all, because there's no trees down here, very few, and not a lot of people, not a lot of roads up in the northern area. So we've got a fairly large commercial forest. With respect to tenure, the Crown forests are managed through forest management agreements. These are long-term leases held with 3 or 4 different companies, the bigger companies. So they have a secure supply of timber. They are responsible for managing the forest, for doing the forest plans, for harvesting, replanting, those types of things. There are smaller companies that have timber supply licenses, and they're shorter, 2 to 5 years. And then there's a whole bunch of smaller companies that don't have any rights to the land, and it's very difficult for them to engage in economic activity. It's difficult to make decisions. If you want to expand as a post and pole producer, how can you do that if you don't know where the supply is coming from? They have to negotiate with the FMA holders and the timber supply license people. So there's a little bit of a problem with respect to supply and access to that resource. I also wanted to say, if you want to ask questions during the presentation, I'm fine with that. We can go back and forth. So if you have a question along the way, feel free to ask. So taking a look at the timber allocation, the large operators have about 80% of the supply. The small operators who have the timber supply licenses have roughly 20%. And then the smaller guys have to work with those two sets of operators to get a supply. So it's really strongly in favor of the large operators. And this is one of the reasons I think that co-ops might be a better way to go for the smaller operators. If they could work together, they could ensure that they had some sort of supply and make better business decisions. The forest cut, because it's provincial forest, and this is true in the States as well for the public lands, is set by, the supply for cutting is set by the province based on biological principles. It's called AAC, which is Annual Allowable Cut. That is the amount that the FMA holders and all operators are allowed to cut every year. So you can see that's the dark red line up here, and it's roughly at 7 million cubic meters. Where are we in Saskatchewan? A lot less than that. Back in 2000, we were only at 4 million cubic meters, and we sort of peaked around 2005, and then it fell again. So we are not using the available resources in Saskatchewan for wood products. Why is that? Anybody know? It's like a first-year class, a 100-level class. Any questions? Nothing. Okay, so this is why. Major economic problems. And they started around 2006. We have a very strong Canadian dollar. The forest industry here is an export industry. We don't use all the products ourselves. They typically go or went to the United States. So exports become more expensive when the Canadian dollar gets stronger. The second problem, which is less prevalent for Saskatchewan, is the US-Canada lumber dispute, which restricts supply and increases the cost of exports going to the United States. Another big problem is rising fuel costs. Because we are where are our markets? BC, Vancouver, Toronto, China. The higher the cost of fuel, the more expensive it is to get our products to market. And we really don't have good transportation routes from Saskatoon or Saskatchewan to the United States. No direct rail lines, and so where do our products go? It makes it very difficult for the timber industry in Saskatchewan to compete and indeed survive. And what really struck a blow to the timber industry was the subprime meltdown in 2008. Houses are built with wood. If there's no demand for wood, there's no timber industry. So we can take a look at what happened. This would be the harvest volume. So we're up to nearly 12 million cubic meters in 2004 or 5. And in 2008, it drops to just over 2 million. It is recovering a little bit, but not to what it used to be. The same is true if you look at the area harvested in the province. It took a significant decrease down by 2009. So it's just a different measure, area harvested versus volume. This has been hard on the government as well. They're not getting the fees and revenue that they got. $18 million would have been the peak around 2003 or 4, and now it's down to about $1 million.
And that's in Saskatchewan?
This is just Saskatchewan, yeah. So the timber industry really took a hit, and it's not in good shape now, and it's not recovering that quickly.
And that's across Canada, or is it just?
It is across Canada, but comparing Saskatchewan timber competes with BC and Alberta. And you've been out there, you see the size of the trees. They've got very strong industry, but they're hurting as well. So they're looking for new markets rather than the US. They're looking at China and Japan and other types of places. Question?
I'm just interested your views on the value-added kind of side of the forest industry, because I know there's been a lot of raw log exports happening in British Columbia, and that's what's hurting their industry arguably the most, in the sense that what used to have many mills in kind of northern and central British Columbia have been shut down effectively over the last, 7 years. But that we still require those 2x4s. In
Great.
Saskatchewan, we have a booming housing industry, yet we're exporting all of our raw logs to foreign economies.
Yeah.
Doesn't make as much sense to me.
There's lots of talk of value added with the agriculture industry, with forest industry. And one of the problems is, why can't we get something going where that we create value here and sell it? One of the problems is where the markets are. Saskatchewan is about 1 million people. So who are we going to sell these products to? Quite often we need bigger markets to be able to support those types of industries. So even if we were able to manufacture it here, it costs a lot more to ship a product that has the value added to it. So these are some of the problems living where we live and being in a resource extractive type industry. Just to give you an idea of the forest capacity, it's also dropped dramatically. 8 mills closed between 2006 and 2008. There's a couple other mills still going, a big OSB mill in Meadow Lake, a couple of sawmills, and the pulp mill apparently is going to hire 21 people or so in the next month or so, and it's going to start. So, as I said, things are coming back, but it makes it difficult without the forest capacity. When I first got to Saskatchewan, we talked a lot about agroforestry and what we should plant millions of acres of trees. The question is, what do you do with those trees? If you don't have the mills, how are you going to process the trees? So capacity is a big deal when it comes to economic activity. So what's working, or what has worked in the past, is not working right now. So maybe it's time to take a fresh approach and examine different kind of structures, different ways of doing business. So taking a look at the history of forest cooperatives, it's got a long history. They started emerging in the early 1900s in the US and in Canada, mostly in the US, and the forest cooperatives peaked in the 30s and 40s, probably as a result of the Depression. In Canada, they're most popular in Quebec, and the reason for that is because of government support. The government treats cooperatives very favorably, so cooperatives flourish there. What the research also shows is that forest co-ops, when compared to their private counterparts, do much better. So within the forestry sector, cooperatives really do well. The problem is, the biggest problem, especially in the West, there are more private lands in the East, is securing the supply. If we think back to the tenure, who controls the forest resources, how do the smaller groups get access to that supply to be able to make business decisions? So that's one of the biggest problems. There have been a number of forest cooperatives in Canada, anything from worker co-ops to marketing and producer co-ops. I don't think that those would work in Saskatchewan based on where we are, the access to the supply, the industry, the type of businesses we have. What I think might work would be possibly the new generation cooperative. I was putting together a business plan for SRC for their forest research, and in all the reading, everything pointed to the same outcome. What's the timber industry or the forest industry going to look like when it recovers? And it's not going to look anything like it looks now, which means 2x4s, posts and poles. There will still be that, there's still a demand for that, but we will find new and better ways to use the forest. So when we think about these things, we have to start thinking about capturing new markets. Where are these markets? What are they for? The world is hungry for clean energy. This comes from a report by the Forest Products Association of Canada. The world's hungry for clean energy. Why don't we use our forests for energy? Green jobs. We're always talking in Saskatchewan, especially northern Saskatchewan, about the lack of jobs and the need for non-mining type jobs. Why not forest jobs in a lot of those places? Climate change is another big issue. Forests are great carbon sinks, so we should be considering them. Ultimately, the new forest economy is going to be a bioeconomy. This is what all the research is saying. So this is probably not that clear for everybody in the back, but what this is just a diagram showing what the bioeconomy is. What does it really mean? And basically, we're using raw materials from the forests, so all the tree, not just the wood, but the bark, the little twigs, the tops, needles, everything, to produce things like building materials, nutrition, source of nutrition, food, different types of food, pharmaceuticals, packaging. We don't do any of these types of things in Saskatchewan right now. Right here, district heating and electricity. This is what they focus on in northern Scandinavia. Most of the towns in the north are heated by wood pellets, steam, and district heating. Perhaps we should have that in La Ronge or other places. So that's what the bioeconomy is. It's a lot different opportunities, things that we haven't thought of, but that there is an increasing demand for. So would new gen co-ops be the way to go? We go back to your point on value added. Can we add value to these types of products where we're not sending big pieces of furniture or big traditional type products, but smaller types of products? What about the energy, producing that energy and processing it in a place like northern Saskatchewan and using it there? The groups that get involved in the new gen co-op would have greater profits because they're involved in many different aspects of the business, not just producing the posts and the poles. They have greater access to capital and technology because of the cooperative. Many of the small producers right now are too small to go it on their own, and a lot of them have failed, especially over the last little while. In a situation like this, producing something new that there was a demand for locally might be a better way to go. So who would the people be? Small operators, could be any forest operators, governments, municipalities, the same types of groups that you see in northern Scandinavia. Community, there's room for education and training, providing jobs, providing education, and working with SAS Power to put the excess power back on the grid, perhaps. So I think that these groups could be interested in doing this. I think there are opportunities if we're willing to explore them. I think there's a lot of advantages. Going back to the tree, there are new opportunities in the bioeconomy. Produces regional development, local employment. These are all issues that we hear all the time, particularly for the north. And then a focus on sustainable energy. So some of the questions I have for the research that I'll go forward with is the policy conducive to taking a cooperative approach? And by policy, I mean SAS Power. Can SAS Power put the energy back on the grid, the electricity back on the grid? Are they willing to do that? Are they willing to be a cooperator to work with wood waste? What about forest policy? How do these small groups get access, long-term access, not just 2 to 5 years, how do they get access to a timber supply so that they can make good business decisions and make long-term investments in the infrastructure and capital that they would need? You know, if we're talking about a pellet mill or something like that. Who will participate? This is all great stuff. You can cook it up at the university, but who would actually participate? How do you get the groups together to get something like this off the ground? And is there social interest? This is one of the things I noticed. It's quite prevalent. When you go to Northern Europe, they recycle everything, absolutely everything. One of the towns we were in, they produced zero waste. Zero waste. They either burned it to produce energy or composted it at probably great expense, but that was okay. That was part of their social fabric. That's what they were willing to pay for. We don't do that here, so maybe that's a problem. Maybe that's why we don't see it in Saskatchewan. The social interest isn't high enough. Can we increase the interest? So these are some of the things that we would have to look into. So if we go back to the 3 points, the timber resources are available. We're not using what we have right now. The timber resources are suitable for producing a vast range of products. The traditional timber economy will likely move to the bioeconomy. rather than the posts and poles and 2x4s and everything else we produce. We should be using the forests in a better way to produce a vaster range of products that we can produce and consume here. So based on these characteristics, I think forest cooperatives might be suitable for local producers and local consumers. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
I guess we would welcome any questions right now for Haley, if anyone is interested in asking her anything. Go ahead, Joe.
I lived in Prince Albert for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And the big pulp mill was there. And of course, you know how it is. We had problems with the
We
smell.
can't hear you.
Well, we had problems with the smell of the pulp mill,
Yeah.
of course. And this kind of thing. When the wind blew a certain direction and hit one part of the city, you want to blew the other way out of the other side. But those kind of things we seem to learn to live with. And but as the years went by, it was very important industry in Prince Albert. There were 700, I think, some
Mhm.
jobs.
Yeah.
And but there seemed to be this business of companies coming in, taking it over, and trying to sell it to somewhere else.
Yeah.
And on 2 occasions, the government of Saskatchewan came in to try and hang on to the pulp mill. And but the last thing that I remember about the pulp mill was the move. If you remember the move, and there was an agreement by government to put 100,000 into the pulp mill, maintain those jobs as minutes as possible, or get them back because we'd already lost them.
Yeah.
And but then when the government that was thrown out, the next government said the move's dead, and that's the end of that. So, you know, this kind of thing, I think, has influenced a lot of forest activity in Prince Albert area, for sure. And like it had such a network of mills in
Yeah.
different spots.
Yeah.
And timber groups that, you know, could get the timber out and take it to the mill. I mean, there were a lot of jobs involved,
Yeah.
but it was all.
Yeah, you have the key player, and the smaller groups feed the pulp mill with the materials. When the pulp mill goes away, all the smaller businesses go away. And so I think that's one of the problems with the big industry, one horse town kind of thing, like Uranium City. When the mine closed, everybody had to leave. There was nothing left to do. So rather than focus on the one large timber producer, perhaps we should have smaller groups. The other thing that struck me about the pulp mill was, why use it to produce pulp? It did produce a lot of energy, and enough energy to run the pulp mill as well as the city of Prince Albert. But I don't know that power was ever sold back to the grid to run.
Well, no, that was part of what the move was going to do.
Okay.
Was make sure that excess power was fed back to the grid.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, because that's a resource that we're just wasting. So.
You see, changes of government in this province have made such a devastating effect, or had a devastating effect on a lot of industries, a lot of good things, you know, that could have been worked out better.
Yeah.
For the betterment of the people and the industry.
I've got a couple of questions. One is, what about the far north? Are there any wood products there?
In the far north.
Yeah, you showed the picture showing where the timber is located. What about north of that? Is there any wood?
Yeah, there's wood right up into the territories,
Yeah.
but there is not so much industry because the roads stop when you get a little ways up.
Yeah.
Like in Uranium City, we had to fly in only, but we were surrounded by trees.
Yeah.
So in a case like that, perhaps a small boiler could be set up with people doing some forestry operations to provide heat for themselves.
Well, that's my second area here.
Mhm.
Like these big mills, they were confined to pulp, which there sort of ceased to be a market for.
Yep.
But there are these other purposes, such as energy production, pellets, and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And these could presumably be developed on a much smaller basis.
Yep.
And but it's a couple of things. You likely aren't aware of the Wood Products Cooperative that was organized by a group at Cumberland House many moons ago.
Nope.
Yeah, well, but there was a group at Cumberland House that formed a cooperative and to cut the logs and produce material. And so my feeling would be that there's potential
Mhm.
for smaller groups organizing to produce on the basis that they could produce on.
Yeah. So what happened to the co-op in Cumberland House?
Well, as I remember, they used up all of the trees in that area that were available for the purpose that they were organized for.
Hmm.
But the one suggestion is, or comment, that when you're talking about cooperatives, you're talking about cooperatives organized by people who don't necessarily have the training in being either members or directors or managers or co-ops. And my experience was, I was with the government at the time, that there was management advisors available to assist these people to set up their cooperative, to learn to operate it. And I think that that's one of the things needed in the North. That there's no use going out and talking about organizing without having resources there to help those people to operate an organization, as well as to develop a market, the kind of products they have.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That's similar to, they do that in Sweden as well with respect to forest management.
Yeah.
There's a lot of private woodlots, and the government will go to help the people manage the wood and select the trees to make sure it's sustainable. Mm-hmm.
Now, Carol, you're talking about 19...
Well, don't tell her when it was.
No, but I showed you that if you could do
Okay.
it then, you can do it now.
We'll come back to this side, we'll deal with three down.
Okay.
Start with Isabel.
Thank you. I agree that there are no good roads up north, but there are people.
There are.
And I was very surprised that you didn't talk about people with a very different economy and a different relation to the economy and a different understanding of resources. And I've been working for about 6 years with a co-op up north that represents an organization that covers 500,000 square kilometers of northern Saskatchewan. And they have Aboriginal treaty and trapping rights. So how does your proposal jive with a very different relation to the land, to the wood, with constitutionally protected rights to those and a duty to consult whenever there might be development that interferes with those rights?
I think those groups would have to be part of the co-op, and for sure would have to, duty to consult would be a big thing. From my work with some of those groups, they're interested in education and jobs and training, and not just preserving the trapping and the traditional things, but to secure jobs to sort of balance between the old lifestyle and the new lifestyle. So in some case I could see how that would be incredibly contentious. So it would have to depend on the communities and what they wanted. In certain communities, if that's not what they wanted, then it likely wouldn't work. Places like maybe a little farther south, like L'Orange, where there is more traditional economic activity, might be a better place to start to see if a pilot plant would work. But I think they would definitely have to be part of the process and consultation as something was explored.
In the Swedish example that you gave, you indicated essentially that there's more people there, yes? So where it might make sense or be economically viable in a more populated district to have that kind of a plant, does that model translate into the much more sparsely populated Saskatchewan remote border forest?
Yeah, I don't think that kind of a model would translate to Uranium City, where there's maybe 89 people living there. I think there would be some sort of minimum, there would be a threshold where it was economically feasible versus not. And I don't know what that would be. When we've traveled to these places, we quite often get tours of facilities and such, and there are a lot of people, we get to meet a lot of business people with innovative ideas, and I've seen some really small operations, I don't know how you describe them, but they can put them in a lot of different places. You can have a small cogen burning type thing that you feed pellets, and you can do this for one single business. So depending on the technology and the resources available, in this case they would need pellets, I think there's a lot of opportunities to explore very much smaller scale operations to produce heat and energy. But large scale things like the example in Sweden, I don't think that would work too far north.
Was there a question at the back?
Yes, actually it was very much related to what has already been discussed. You mentioned the engagement of the society might be one of the issues in this. And in the research that I found that was the most important aspect. It was somewhat related to this topic. But I'm asking, wouldn't a model, an economic model in which the citizens from that community would be just shareholders in these cooperatives, wouldn't that be the answer to the engagement problem as well?
I think that would work. If people bought into it, literally, they would be engaged. This particular mill, the one that does the district heating in Skellefteå, the people own shares in that mill. And so they have an incentive to reduce their consumption, to use that particular product, and if they reduce consumption, they pay lower bills, but at the other end, they export a lot of the energy, and then they win that way too. So either way, they're very much engaged.
Haley, I had a question about the impact of the 2008 downturn on forestry co-ops in Quebec. Do you have any of that kind of comparative?
I don't actually. I'm not far enough down the path where I've looked really deeply into the co-ops and how they were affected and how those things might translate to Saskatchewan. I do know that with respect to the softwood lumber dispute, that Ontario, Quebec, BC, and Alberta have been most hardly hit. And so I would imagine that those groups would be feeling the same pinch that the larger industry was.
Haley, in Scandinavia, how much do you think the forest tenure arrangements in Scandinavia facilitate the development of these co-ops? And because it sounds like most of the forests are privately owned woodlots.
Yeah.
And does that give you some information on, like, does there need to be some change in terms of forest tenure in Saskatchewan to enable the development of those types of co-ops?
I think our forest tenure is a big problem. It's very restrictive. We can't get the supply. It's not managed according, our resources, same in the States, are not managed according to markets. And I think that's because of a general fear of markets. You know, prices go up and we clear cut everything, which is not the case. But I think that's a good point. A lot of families own their forests, and they've been in the family for years and years. And the state forester will come out and they will select the trees, and they work directly with the mills to provide a long-term supply. So I think we do need a different forest tenure arrangement. And I've seen lots of research on that, but nothing ever moves, nothing changes. Yeah.
And perhaps the last question from John?
Well, this is a very fresh breeze. And the potential is there for major changes. What channels of communication do you use, or what channels of communication are available to you?
The channels within which I work right now are the Saskatchewan Research Council, the SRC. I work with a forest ecologist there, and we work with the Saskatchewan government. And we've looked at different ways of using the forest. We haven't talked about how we might change tenure, how we might develop new initiatives like this. But those are the two channels I work with. He is also part of the Model Forest, the Canadian Model Forest Network, and the Model Forests of the world. And the Model Forest is interesting because it is really about community. The Model Forest is not an actual forest with trees, it's about community and how we use the forests, how we come together to talk about traditional land use, and how we talk about new products. So I think the thing to do would be to engage with the Model Forest, and they're partners with the Swedish Model Forest, the Vilhelmina, a couple of forests in Russia, the Syktyvkar Model Forest in the Komi Republic, or the Komi Model Forest, and to come up with a basic idea that we could explore. Because it focuses on people, we would have to talk about who the right people would be. That, off the top of my head, would be what I might do next.
Well, if I might just add a little bit more. As I see the whole challenge, it boils down to education. It boils down more so to leadership. And what kind of leadership, from whom, for whom? Is it going to be an economy that is historical, or is it going to be something new like the bioeconomy? I have a lot of credibility for your comments because you're from the north and you understand a lot. But I break this whole business of education down into various groups. There's the government, there's the crowns, there's the northern people, there's the academics, the media, and others we could all mention.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very impressed with what you've done in terms of the research, the information, the potential. And it'll take a lot of work, a lot of involvement, and that brings up the whole area of public policy. For whom? What kind of public policy? And who will benefit? Who will pay? And I see a lot of potential in this whole area of the economic bio approach. And why shouldn't society contribute something to the kind of contribution that a co-op for forests could contribute to society? Anyway.
Very good points. Thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure to hear such innovative ideas that were cooperative for a challenging situation in the forestry sector. So thank you, Haley.
You're welcome.
And, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.